This is Tear Off the Tape, a project from the group at I Got Mind, discussing the often overlooked emotional and psychological toll of trauma. Now, here's your host, Bob Wilkie.
Hi, everybody. Really excited about the conversation that we're going to have today with Sherry Lux. A wonderful story, having a profound impact in the world today. But it's an interesting story that I think all of our listeners are really going to enjoy. And it's nice, so much of the show has been male guests. And it's not for any one reason other than that's the majority of the network. I've had the really good fortune of meeting Sherry through the Wounded Warriors Initiative in one of our Sideways showings. And yeah, we met and had a great chat. And I said, I'd love to have you on the show. And so she's going to be here today. It's about being vulnerable, practicing that. Tear Off the Tape is all about being able to heal who we are, understanding that our stories don't need to carry the shame and guilt, but it's not until we're tearing off that tape that we can really start to live the life that we want. So I'm going to bring Sherry in and we're going to get started. Sherry, thank you so much for being here today. Really excited to tear off the tape with you.
Thank you so much for having me, Bob. I'm very excited to be here.
Yeah. And what I love about these most is it's just a conversation, right? There's no script, there's no slides. It's just two people talking some things out. So what I've learned on my journey in being able to heal all the different trauma, rough patches, unfortunate, incidents, however you want to label them, it was that when I started to talk about it, when I started to open up, that's when I could really start to unload and unpack a lot of things, but a lot of it stemmed from my childhood. So all of our episodes start with, kind of how we were growing up. Where did you grow up? How was it growing up? What was going on in your house? If you don't mind kind of kicking off the story with how it begun for you.
So I am originally from Saskatchewan, from Humboldt, Saskatchewan, and we bounced around many of the towns and small cities. My parents were high school sweethearts. They met in their teens. By the time my mom was 19, she was married with 2 kids. My dad worked for the family business, and times were actually really good in the really early years of my childhood. And then things, mid 80s, things kind of went a little sideways for my dad's family business. And we actually went through a period of hardship where he had to declare bankruptcy. And that was actually very difficult on the family. That was what led us to kind of bouncing around the province. So we lived in Humboldt, actually where we boarded hockey players. And then we moved to Nacum and Swift Current and Moose Jaw. And we kind of did these very short stints around Saskatchewan. And for example, grade 1, I think I started grade 1 in 3 different towns. And, at the time I had great supportive parents. I had an older brother. And we just that's just how it was. My parents we had a very open communication and all of that. And eventually we ended up in Saskatoon where I actually finished high school there. And, it's funny because looking back, I've always thought I had this incredibly blessed childhood, and I still do. But after I have gone through some of the circumstances that I've gone through, and I know we'll get into that, it's actually made me unpack a lot of my childhood. And I've seen where some of my, codependency, for example, was something that I had to overcome later in life. And I had to unpack some of those early years and had to look at why I was such a people pleaser and why I would bend over backwards to the point of losing myself in order to maintain relationships that weren't even necessarily healthy for me. And then what that process looked like as I overcame it. So it's funny because had you asked me about my childhood 15 years ago, I would have said it was idyllic. And now that I've been through all the hard stuff and I've come out the other side, I give my parents credit. They did the best they could, like all parents do. But, some of those circumstances did leave some lasting scars that did show up later in life. And I think that is actually kind of part of why we're here, is to unpack some of those and heal from them.
I find it so interesting that you bring up that dad, kind of went through bankruptcy with the business and tough. And unfortunately, I've gone through that as well. I know the impact it had on me as the man in the house, but I also know how it started to affect my kids. When that happened, because it blows everything up, right? Every sense of normal that we have, all of a sudden it's all gone. What were some of the things that maybe you can recall or share with the audience of when there was a difference in dad, in mom, right? That whole relationship, I'm sure, started to change. Now you're moving around a little bit. What was going on for you kids? Did the parents communicate? Like, describe that time a little bit.
It really did blow up the house in a sense. I was fairly young. I mean, I think I was 5 or 6. So I don't remember the actual impact of when things really fell apart. And I don't even really remember the good years. I just remember our house always being full of laughter and fun. You know, in Humboldt, I had both sets of grandparents. I had aunts and uncles. It was just, we had that very small town vibe. I had a lot of cousins. And so there was lots of nights where we're family dinners and playing cards and just a lot of really nice family memories. I do have that. Then when we started moving around, definitely my anxiety was through the roof. Grade 1, you know, those early years are very formative. And yeah, there was a lot for me to work through. And I kind of had to do it, I don't want to say on my own. Dad was very preoccupied and mom was just trying to fill in all the gaps where she could. You know, that was a little different from how it had been when we lived in Humboldt. And, you know, we had this beautiful acreage and all of that. And now we were, you know, bouncing around and spending, I mean, I think in a couple of those places, we didn't do more than a month or two. And so my anxiety was through the roof. I actually started having a lot of night terrors and things like that. My parents were supportive, but my dad was just trying to pay the bills. So he was, you know, to say preoccupied was an understatement. I'm very lucky to come from a family where communication has always been very open. So they were always honest with us. But I mean, I remember having to make all the sacrifices. You know, I didn't get the new jeans and the new shoes and the new things that other kids got. And, you know, I remember times got really tough and mom had to start selling some of our stuff. Then that was back when you had to put an ad in the newspaper just to pay groceries and stuff. So, you know, I do remember some of that. That happened till probably I was 14, 15. By then we had moved to Saskatchewan and dad had started his own company and things were taking off. But I mean, even when he started his own company, he was working 24/7 around the province. That was part of his claim to fame in the beginning was he was, you know, a garage door. He had a garage door business, but he was 24/7. And so he would often get up in the middle of the night and have to drive somewhere. So dad was just working a lot. And mom was always there. She was always at home. Eventually she started running a daycare, which, you know, kept her home and it brought money in. But I also hated that. I had kids in my stuff and I'd come home and there'd be all these kids and I'd have to babysit a bit. But, you know, I mean, looking back, we laugh at it and it was what it was. But yeah, definitely. I know that's where a lot of my anxiety stems from for sure.
I think it's an interesting correlation, right? Because a lot of people don't realize those things until you start to have that conversation and you, oh yeah, that's when that happened. And oh, that's when this happened. And, you know, in being able to heal and overcome, it really is getting to the root cause. And a lot of times just that reflection on the past and what we went through can help us get to that root of the issue. Okay, so you're moving around, your anxiety starts a little bit, you've got some night terrors, things start to normalize. You're 14, 15, getting into our exploration phase. How are you as a teenager, you know, with all this going on? What were some of the things you found yourself kind of getting into? Were you a troublemaker or were you you mentioned people pleaser? What was going on as a young woman?
Well, interesting. So by the time I was about 14, I think at that point, mom and dad were able to buy another home. So, you know, when we were bouncing around, we were renting. So now we were in our own home. They had actually bought a lot at a lake nearby. And so, and they were very hands-on. And so they would, you know, every weekend they'd go to this lot and they would cut down trees and then they would bring the camper up there and they would live out of that while they worked. And so they literally built this cabin from their own 2 hands and then started to meet the neighbors and friends started to buy up there. And so it was really they built this whole new life and community up at the lake. And so, you know, during the week, everyone would be at school and working. And then come the weekend, mom and dad would go to the lake every weekend. And my brother and I did not like to go to the lake because it was just a bunch of working bees. There was nothing fun about it for us being teenagers. We didn't have the boat or anything fun. So it was always just staining things and I don't know, picking rocks. I don't know. There was always just stuff to do, picking weeds. And so mom and dad were fine with us staying home. Well, that led into, we had the house with a lot of the parties. And, looking at those years, they were fun times. They were harmless parties. We were just good kids having fun. Mom and dad knew about the parties for years, I guess, without actually really coming down too hard on us. But eventually the neighbors started complaining and there was a few times things got out of hand. But all in all, I can say my teenage years were great. Dad was making money. And I think he even was parenting a bit out of guilt at that point, where I, I had a car to drive when I was 16 and, I didn't want for anything. But I wasn't like a spoiled brat at the same time because I kind of had those roots of hard work and stuff too. So it was kind of a nice balance in that sense. Like I was still able to be grounded and grateful for everything I was given because now I could actually get the brand name winter jacket and the shoes and things like that. But it was always in the back of my memory where we had come from. So, my teenage years, I would say were a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun, a lot of friends in high school. And, when grade 12 came, it was sad when it all ended. So, that part of my life, I can say it was quite charming.
And it's interesting in the world today, you had described about your dad and, kind of trying to find himself at that stage in his life and being responsible for a family. And, what I see in the world today, Sherry, and I know a lot of the work you do is that a lot of the parents are out there really doing that. The stress is to the max, right? And you're a young woman. I don't know if you were a daddy's girl. I have one of those. Like she was very in tune with when I was struggling and that people pleaser in her really started. I need to make dad happy, all those sorts of things. A lot of the parents today, I think, are struggling with that connection with their kids because they're all running around. You talked about your dad being on 24/7. What have you learned as a parent that's kind of helped you based on that experience and what's happening in the world? Do you find that you have better balance and more in tune with your kids because of these things that you went through?
Yeah, I look back and I think I mistook a lot of my dad's working as a bit of abandonment. Not that he wasn't there, because when I needed him, he was, but he was just doing what men do when they need to provide. And as a child, I think I internalized that as abandonment because he wasn't always there, which I think is what led me into my codependency issues later. With my own kids, I am very honest with them. And I know we'll get into this, but even with some of the circumstances that happened with my first husband, their father. And, I've always been brutally honest with them because I've always been so cognizant of how these tiny little things that from the adult perspective seem small, but to a child, it's actually fascinating to me. Some of the memories that my kids have of their childhood, things that, things I don't even necessarily remember. They were just a random Tuesday to me, but to them, it's something that stuck with them. And so I find that really fascinating because you don't know what's going to stick and the impact it's going to have. And I truly think that no matter how much you do your best as a parent, you just don't know. And I think we're supposed to, I don't want to say mess up our kids a bit, but I think kids are supposed to kind of, undergo some of these circumstances where they internalize things and maybe they shouldn't, and maybe it was innocent at the time, but nonetheless, it leads to further growth down the line when they start to unpack it and see it, how it shows up in their life later. So I'm very, very honest with my kids. I'm very authentic with my kids. If I'm short with them or I don't have time for them, I'm the first one to apologize. I'm very paranoid of them internalizing it. And I will say this actually, and I want to share this because it's a bit on topic, but my daughter, she's 22 now, and she sent me an Instagram meme about 2 weeks ago and it brought tears to my eyes. And it said, "Sometimes I have to remind myself that it's my mom's first time on earth too." And I thought, okay, You understand that if I'm not here, I'm busy or I can't answer the phone or whatever it is, you understand that I'm living my life. I'm doing what I need to do to get through my day as well. And I think kids, so often just want there's that expectation that your parents will just be there. And that's not always the case because parents are still just peopling.
Yeah, trying to figure it out on our own, right? Like we are going to screw up our kids in some way. It's not intentional.
Yeah.
It's their interpretation. And as our brains are developing, that's why we always like to start our stories with, at an early age, because even people with, the initial perception, like you talked about, it was a great childhood. Well, hold on a second. There were some things in there that caused me to think about things differently, to see things differently, to develop different patterns that weren't because anybody was abusive or it was, just a chaotic environment, but they had their own stuff going on. And I think that's what a lot of people can make a connection to when they start doing some of that digging. So now you're getting into, the early maturity of adult. You're 20, you've graduated, things start to change. So we've put our listeners that there's something coming here. Let's start to paint that picture. You're 20 years old. What does life look like now? What's happening for you, Sherry?
Okay, so I'm 20 years old. Mom and dad are living their best life. They're back and forth from the cabin. At this point, my mom is about 6 years into her cancer battle. When I was 14 years old, she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer and she was given 6 months to live. And she ended up beating that. She had surgeries and whatnot. And so now we're about 6 years into her remission. We're always very worried about mom. But nonetheless, life was good. So she was good at that point. Life was good. And I got accepted to the U of S. I was working on my English degree. I wanted to be a high school English teacher. And so I was doing that. And then when I was about 21, I was getting a little antsy in Saskatoon. A lot of my friends had moved away. And my girlfriend, who had gone away to school in Lethbridge, convinced me to come out and spend a year living with her and taking classes basically as a transfer credit out in Lethbridge. And so that is what I did. And so I was about 21 at this point, and I'm living in Lethbridge. I had been there for about 3 months. It was fantastic living with my best friend. We had this cute little apartment, and life was just really, really good. And about 3 months into it, we were at the club one night, as college kids are, and I met Mike. And Mike immediately swept me off my feet, and he immediately felt like home. And that was kind of the beginning of the next era of my life. So we had been dating, and about 4 or 5 months into it, he got accepted into the RCMP. So he had to move to Regina, to Depot, to do training. I finished school in Lethbridge for the year. And we used to meet in Swift Current because that was kind of the halfway point. And then he graduated, and I had some decisions to make. So was I going to move back in with mom and dad and get my teaching degree? Or was I going to move with him to his first posting, which was, your first posting is, I think, fairly out of your control. So yeah, that was a roll of the dice. And we had done 6 months long distance at that point, and we didn't want to do that anymore. So I ended up finishing my degree, my first degree, and then moving up to the northern community of La Loche, Saskatchewan, with him. And that was when we started our life. So that was his first posting as an RCMP officer. I was working at the local store. It was a 2-year posting. And from there, we didn't really know where we were going to end up. And we were lucky enough to get Saskatoon, which was an absolute dream come true. And, by the time I was 26 years old, I was married, 2 kids, a mortgage. I was a stay-at-home mom. I was living the exact life I wanted to live. That was also around the time when my mom actually lost her battle with cancer. So that was a bittersweet time for me. Actually, we lost mom about a year before my son was born. So that was a death that I still struggle with to this day. She was my best friend, and we had such a close relationship. And but being there, and my one of my greatest gifts, I think, was having Mike know my mom. And it was only for a few short years, but they were so close, and it was just he was able to help me through that grieving process because he knew who she was. But yeah, so I mean, my mid-20s, I'm, obviously our family's navigating death and grief, which was not easy for us at all. At that point, she had been struggling for 12 years. So it was a bit of a bittersweet. Her quality of life was very poor by the end of it. But nonetheless, she was young. She was in her mid-40s at that point. Yeah, so that was kind of my 20s. And by the time I was 30, I got my teaching degree, and the kids were in school, and I was a teacher, and Mike was our CMP, and we were just living this, nice little ideal life, to be honest. Finally had a little more money now that I was working, and and it was very important for both of us that I stay home with the kids. We both grew up with stay-at-home moms, so we kind of had those, that same traditional value system. But yeah, and then and that was about in my early 30s. So life is good in my 20s, and then we moved to Regina, which is great. He gets stationed at headquarters, which is great. And that was about the time I actually found out that I carried the same gene as my mom. So we didn't know this, but at the time, we had a lot of family members getting cancer young and dying young. And, my mom's story, that was similar to my grandfather's story and her sister's story. And you could kind of go up the family tree. We didn't think there was anything to it per se, but it turns out there was. So there was a gene being passed around in my family. My aunt convinced me to get testing done, found out I was positive. I was the same age as my mom when she was diagnosed. So I started what would become the first of, I didn't know this at the time, but the first of 9 surgeries. So we're in Regina. I'm teaching, he's working, kids are great, and things very quickly start to unravel. And that was when it took a little bit of time, but it ended up my husband was suffering from PTSD, and he had about a 3-year period where our house was completely upside down because of it. And, on top of that, I'm going through my surgeries as well, which were traumatizing to me. It left my body disfigured, and I was hiding it from everyone. So I'm going to work and managing doctor's appointments, managing surgical care. It was awful. I had complications that I didn't even know if I was going to recover from. So that went on for a couple years. And then my husband actually lost his battle with PTSD, about 3 years of us living in Regina, which then, of course, was devastating. Our kids at that point were 10 and 14. And that led me on a whole new journey, a whole new pivot of my life. I was 37, a widow with 2 kids, and going through my own health journey and not understanding how I got to that stage of my life. And I mean, at that point, my life was completely unrecognizable. It was crazy how night and day it had become.
It's such a fascinating transition of so many different things going on. And I just want to touch on one that strikes me is that when you meet Mike, you said he swept me off my feet. Love is, I think, something that everybody wants in life, but I don't necessarily know that a lot of people are prepared for what can occur when that kind of love happens, right? We don't understand that it's not always going to be like I'm being swept off my feet, right? There's those dark times where there's no communication, that we see the difference in the other person, that we get into conflict, that we experience, like you did with the loss of your mom, and the sadness and the grief that comes with that. And love is the thing that helps us get through those things, but we don't necessarily recognize, because it doesn't feel like I'm being swept off my feet, right? And love can be confusing for a lot of people. What have you learned about love through all of these different things, Sherry? How do you look at love now? Because I know that you're in a new phase, and we'll get to that. But love teaches us a lot of things. What are some of the things that you've learned about love?
I weave. I weave in and out. I think when my mom passed away, there was a piece of my heart that truly, truly broke. And I, I don't speak of her very often and I don't get very emotional, but there was just a piece of me that just kind of fell off. I don't think anyone in our family handled her death very well. When your heart is broken, it takes time to mend. And sometimes, this is interesting. I was fortunate enough to be in a healthy, stable marriage where my husband helped me heal that part of me. My children helped me heal that part of me. However, after my husband died, another piece of my heart broke. And so I've always kind of felt like I've been walking around with half a heart between those two deaths. And I will say the deaths of my aunts, and even my mother-in-law, who she also lost her battle of cancer. I lost so many of my close people, all by the time I was in my early 30s. And, so it was just kind of piece of my heart just kind of kept, it was just a scab that just couldn't quite heal. So by the time my husband had passed away, I had lived a few more years in Regina, just working on myself, healing myself, doing deep, uncomfortable, dark dives with myself. And by the time I made the leap to move to Calgary about 4 years ago, I was perfectly fine to not even really use my heart anymore. I was, I was independent. I was doing my own thing. I had raised my kids. I had a couple years till my son was going to graduate. And then I was like, I'm okay on my own. And if that's what my life looks like, so be it. I can have a full life. And I was prepared for that. When about 6 months after moving here, I met who was going to be now my second husband. And I was very skittish with him. Bless his soul, the patience that man has had for me. And so I truly think we have the ability to heal ourselves if we need to. But I also think if we can open ourselves up, the right people will come in and start to just kind of be a bit of a compress on the wound, right? Where it can just kind of calm down and just heal. And so part of this for me really is me healing my nervous system. It's really what a lot of this was. And he gives me the space to do it, whether I'm not always the most easy person because of it, but he works with that. And we've had lots of conversations about it. And, all he says is I take the full package, and that's what you come with. And I take the full package, and we unpack it all together. And I mean, just to hear those words from someone and someone who loves my kids as if they're his own, and who talks about my late husband as if he was a friend he just never really got to meet. And and the respect that he has for my former life, and yet the role he plays now moving forward. So yeah, I have weaved in and out of love, and my heart has been closed and open and closed again. And it kind of does a bit of a dance.
Yeah, and I think, in my own journey of healing, what I found was really important. A lot of my teachers, kept drilling into my head is you got to love you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my experience was when I was going through all those different challenges in life that were traumatic, right? That psychological injury, it closes your heart down because you don't want to deal with that sort of pain. But it's the love, and continuing to fight for that really allowed me to start that healing process. So when I started to love myself, then others were able to love me too. And I think that's what happens with a lot of people when they go through these psychological injuries, the traumas of life, is that we just start to shut ourselves down because we don't want to put ourselves at risk for that anymore. But that's part of life, right? A life well lived is going to have a lot of these experiences, but we do have to understand that the first couple of times before we start to learn, we may start to close ourselves off and not want any more of that kind of love because it hurts when we lose it, Sherry.
Yeah, it does. And, to speak to your point about loving yourself. So, if we back up a few years when our house was chaotic in Regina, and I went through very dark period. So PTSD shows up in various ways, but in our house, it showed up as, he was very withdrawn, and there was alcohol abuse and lots of fighting, lots of yelling, lots of screaming, from both ends, holes in the walls. I have behavior that I'm not real proud of, but didn't even know I was in the storm. Like I was, like, looking back, it's so clear to me how it kind of evolved. And I've had a lot of grace for both of us. And I've asked my kids for that as well. Just because, we were trying to do the best we could with what we knew and what we had. But during that time, so, keep in mind, my body's disfigured, and there's just all kinds of things going on in my head regarding my own self-esteem and my own marriage and all of this. And I actually started turning to the arts unbeknownst to me. I didn't even know I was doing it, but I started turning to the arts, and that is actually what started to give me back those glimmers of self-love. And so I started painting, and that was how I got into my candles, and eventually even writing, which, I started my own candle company and my artwork, and I ended up writing a book through it all, but none of that was for anybody else. That was all for me. And the healing that came through that, where I could just get lost in something and start to reconnect with who I was again, and start to rebuild that self-esteem piece by piece, regardless of what was going on around me. And so I started that process even before he had passed away. And then, of course, when he passed away, I didn't see the light of day for a long, long time. And I dove pretty deep back into the arts. And I truly, truly believe, I'm a big advocate for, finding healing through the arts, finding something that just you do for you, that just brings you joy, where you can get lost. I find a lot of people go back to things that made them happy in their childhood, whether it was singing or music or sports or painting or drawing. And it sounds so simple, but it is so powerful. And so I absolutely agree that you do have to find that love for yourself. And I think it's surprising where people can actually find that love for themselves, those little pockets that they do just for them.
And now, more with Bob Wilkie and Tear Off the Tape.
You talk about finding the arts, and that helped you find some joy, right? Purpose in life that allows us to continue to move forward when we go through that loss of love, when we go through those traumatic experiences that life provides for us. It's being able to recognize that I need to find some purpose in my life. That allows us to get back to feel like we're contributing, like we're on the right track, which, is easier to love than when we're stuck and kind of allowing ourselves that self-pity. I always got into the guilt or the regret, living in the past. Our mental health clinician talks about it's like a rocking chair, right? We rock into the past or we rock into the future. And what we're missing is every moment that's in front of us. And when we lose that love, when we lose that purpose, that ability to be in the moment and recognize that I do have life pretty good gets missed a lot. And I think with people moving at such breakneck speed as we are today, there's a lot of people that are in that rocking chair. It's past and future, when, the good things really happen in the here and now.
Yeah, no, I agree. I really don't get too caught up in the past anymore. I have, I think I lived there for a long, long time. I think grief will do that to you because it comes in waves and it can be paralyzing. And then I actually just had to get to a point where, to be honest, I was sick of myself, and I was sick of thinking about, I was sick of crying about, I was tired. I wanted to live again. I just wanted to live again. And I truly didn't believe that my story ended at 37. Because, that's the age I was when he passed away, and then my life changed. But it sure felt like that at the time. It sure felt like there was no purpose and no point. And I knew I had kids and I had to be there, but man, I know how dark can get. And, and Yeah, it is just being able to find those little glimmers that can kind of just pull you back just a little bit at a time, and then allow that to kind of take on a life of its own if you're fortunate enough to have that. So it's just being open-minded. And sometimes it's actually coming back to the basics, I think. The world's moving so fast. And I truly think so much of it's coming back to the basics that, yes, we're physical and emotional beings. We're also spiritual beings. We have to nurture all those sides of us. And we're stepping into a new way of doing life. And I think what used to be so woo-woo, it's just common day talk now. And I think people are starting to understand that there is a deeper spiritual side to us that also needs to be nurtured. And it's not religion. It's a spiritual, right? Like it's just something, it's the essence of who we are. And I truly believe that's why I think that we are here to learn lessons and to grow. And that's how we do it.
Tough love. Again, it's interesting how love gets pulled into that conversation. For me, and you described it, you kind of hit that rock bottom and it's like, I got to build myself up again. For me, it was showing myself a little bit of that tough love. Listen, I didn't like it when my parents showed me tough love. I didn't like it when my coaches or my friends, would show me that tough love, but it really was, you got to get your head out of your ass and you got to get going because you've wasted, you know what I mean? Here's a decade that's gone. And now, you're a family man and you've got all these things to provide for. You don't have any time so sometimes we do have to show ourselves that little bit of tough love, give ourselves a kick in the ass to kind of get going too, right, Sherry? I mean, that's kind of what helped you.
100%. And I find I'm the most successful and I make the biggest leaps in my life when I'm mad. And, even the branding for my company, it's Finding My Fire. The name of my book is Finding My Fire. I give myself space and grace to cocoon is what I call it. And I'll shut people out. I'll just do what I need to do. I know how to kind of give myself what I need in those moments. And then I kind of get mad that, maybe I've been cocooning too long or mad at circumstances or whatever it is, but it's enough to fuel me to start, even just to do one small step in the right direction for me, whatever that is. And those one small steps, they've led to really life-changing things for me over time. You don't realize it at the time, but for me, a lot of it was that anger that actually is what gave me my fire to move forward. Because I didn't want to be sad anymore. I didn't want to be sitting. I was sick of it. When I say I was sick of myself, I mean, we are doing life a different way moving forward. It was, those conversations you kind of have with yourself. One day you're tired of it. You don't want to be like that anymore. And you don't want to be ruminating anymore. And it was same, I think therapy is great for a lot of people, but I kind of reached my capacity with it. I would be in a great mood and I would have therapy booked. And I would come out and I'd be down for a few days. And I started to realize the power of finding your own people. I was lucky enough to be introduced to group therapy. So I got to experience that, where you find your people and you're given this safe space to just kind of unpack everything. But that ended up being my go-to moving forward. So I just started doing things differently. And even that, I'd been in therapy for so many years, even making that decision. No, I feel better when I'm speaking with someone who's been through what I've been through. Now I was craving lived experience. I was craving people that just knew what it was like to be a single mom with teenage kids and what's grief and what's teenage stuff. And, how do you navigate that and still be what they need amongst their trauma and my trauma? And, I was craving people that could speak to my experience because they lived it. So yeah, you kind of get mad and then you kind of make changes, right? Like it's something. For me, it was getting mad. For someone else, might be something different, but there was something there, that spark that ignited a change.
One of my mentors taught me the phrase healthy dissatisfaction. And, as I was going through these different transitions, these different figuring out phases, I've come to realize that it's that healthy dissatisfaction where we're to the point where it's going to move me in a direction where it's going to solve the problem rather than compound the problem, right? When we have that unhealthy dissatisfaction, we get into that self-loathing, that self-sabotage, that judgment, right? Things that aren't going to produce good things. But when it's healthy dissatisfaction, that's when we can start to put one foot in front of the other and recognize what we need to do for ourselves. Because this feeling crappy all the time and right being angry at the world, that doesn't solve anything, Sherry. That tends to make it harder to live.
Yeah. And I really don't fall into victim mode. And I think a lot of people can get caught in that trap, and that can be a really, I don't know, it can be a bit of a dangerous cycle to get out of that loop. I've never really had pity. Even when I got the diagnosis, I guess if you want to call it, that I carried this gene, I was thrilled. Not thrilled, that's not quite the right word. I was relieved. But yeah, I was relieved because I had always lived since I was 14 years old. My mom's specialists were constantly poking and prodding me because she was so young, and so they wanted to keep a close eye on me. So I had been having that happen to me for 20 years. So by the time I was in my mid 30s, when I got the news that I had the gene, I was just relieved because I knew what I had to do. And I had to have the surgeries, and I knew that, and I was prepared for that. And I knew that meant I wasn't going to be able to have kids. And I knew that, we had to be okay with we had to make sure we didn't want any more than the two that we had. And I knew that my body was going to be different. And whereas at the time, my husband, he actually took it as if I had just gotten a cancer diagnosis. So he got really upset as if I was dying and all of this stuff. And we had to have some, hard discussions because I thought this was a good thing. I thought this meant we were a little bit more in control of my health and what that meant. And if it could spare my kids what I had to go through with my mom, to me, that was a positive, even though I wasn't looking forward to any of it. It technically wasn't the good news we wanted, but it was better than not knowing. I'd rather know than not know. So I've never really, I've never really been too much with that victim mentality. I think it can keep people really quite stuck.
You bring up the power of knowing for you, right? Two different perceptions here. You're talking about, okay, I'm glad I know, right? But your husband goes the other way. It was like, I don't want to know. And I think a lot of people, Sherry, get stuck in that ignorance, when they go through something that causes a difference in their life, right? The trauma that we're talking about. It's that ignorance that we want to stay in, that I don't want to know and I don't want to deal with it. But, ignorance is not bliss. There's that saying, ignorance is bliss. Ignorance is not bliss, right? Ignorance compounds all the problems that we have. And I think it's so important that we understand that if we find ourselves playing the victim, one of the phrases that I wrote down here is, people think that life's not fair. What we have to remind ourselves is who taught you that life was fair and when has it ever been? Right. I think having that expectation that life should be fair for us is a very unrealistic expectation that sets us up for more pain and suffering, when the expectation should be, I'm going to make the most of the life that I have. Right. And again, two different mindsets, but it takes us a long time to gain that wisdom. Right. Because when we're young, it's just pain that we don't know how to process. I want to go back a little bit because this is a real opportunity, I think, for a lot of our audience. You talked about your husband battling with PTSD. What were some of the things as a woman that you experienced or learned about somebody who deals with PTSD? Because I know this is something that you help a lot of wives out there now deal with people who are in first responders. What have you learned about that process of being able to recognize it and how you would do things differently today?
Yeah, that was such a confusing time because it was really, our house was flipped upside down, but we didn't know why. And as the years had gone on, and then my husband was in therapy and was eventually diagnosed. Again, I was relieved. I was like, oh, okay, we know what we're dealing with. We have a name for it. We can read about it. We can do things. It wasn't really the time because we were still in the fire. But, and this is one thing I speak about, the importance of having this information before the PTSD kicks in, because among first responders, it's pretty inevitable that it will at some point. So I'm a big advocate for the education beforehand versus trying to learn while you're in the storm. Very, very difficult. But yeah, as a woman going through that, I internalized everything. I thought my husband not eating dinner with us was because he didn't like me. All of it. It always boiled down to he was falling out of love with me. He didn't like me. He didn't want to be with me. And it really, really eroded my self-esteem and my self-love because I was still in my people pleasing phase. I hadn't unpacked that yet. So I was kind of running around overcompensating where he was undercompensating. And it just eroded so many pieces of me. Looking back, I always kind of look at my life as if I'm on a planet looking down, and looking back, I now see the bigger picture it needed to bring me down to my knees and just completely, almost that tower moment where you lose everything. I lost all pieces of myself. I didn't know who I was because as a codependent, which I actually went away to group therapy to learn about, actually thanks to my husband, because when he came back from he went away for his alcohol addiction. He came back and he said to me, and keep in mind, he was on cloud nine. He looked amazing. He'd been working out for 2 months. His head, his mind was so clear. He was so excited about life. And we were always so, so close. And so when he came home after being away for 2 months with his treatment, he said to me, Sherry, you have a problem too. You've been contributing to this dynamic. Well, you can imagine I completely lost it on him. I'm the one holding this together. I was all the things. But you know what? I went away. They had offered the spousal treatment. So I went away for a week. I learned all about my codependency and I was able to unpack that. And so going back to your question, I think so many women do that. They just absorb and they overcompensate and they internalize that whatever issue is going on with that man. And, this goes back to being a daddy's girl, right? It goes back. It's like the full circle was making sense to me. And it's not that he doesn't want to be with me. He's literally silently fighting for his life. And he's trying to protect me from that. And he's trying to protect me from the nightmares that keep him awake. And he's trying so hard to be who he thinks I need him to be and put on these masks, even for me. And this was more in the beginning. As we started to learn about it, he started to be more open with me. But in the beginning, which was really the part that was the most damaging to me, because I internalized it all for a long time. So I think women in general tend to do that a lot, where they kind of make it about them and not necessarily in a selfish way. It's just he must not want to be with me. His feelings must have changed. He just doesn't know what to tell me. I thought maybe he was having an affair. All the things go through. Everything goes through your mind because you don't have answers. So you have to make stuff up to try and make sense of it, because I really didn't want to believe this was just how our life was going to be. That was awful. I wanted to, believe there was a reason behind it. And eventually we did find that out and we were able to navigate that as best we could. But obviously my story is a bit of a cautionary tale and that's why I share it, to try and help other people.
I think all of our stories are cautionary tales, right? Of what to be mindful of, what to watch for, what could happen. I know that's what I enjoy about what I do the most, is being able to share my experience so that if somebody finds themselves in that position one day, that maybe they'll remember the story that I told and it'll cause them to go a different path, right? That's all we can do is share our stories in the detail in a way that somebody might be able to relate to it, to pull some strength that they're going to need. Because we all have that, Sherry. You shared a wonderful story of how strong you've been through all of these different challenges that life has thrown at you. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about some of the initiatives that you work on today and are passionate about.
Yeah, I wrote a book. I wrote that during COVID, locked at home with the kids for a couple of years in a city that I really wanted out of. At that point, I think Regina had served its purpose for me. My husband had been gone for a couple years. I had actually tried to move my kids out west, but COVID kept us planted. So during that time, I made the best of it. And my book actually started as a journal, and I was just writing for me. I was just writing to just get my thoughts out. I have always found writing therapeutic. And so eventually I just kind of realized, oh, maybe there's something more to this. And so I published the book in 2022. It's called Finding My Fire. And it's a bit about my life story. It's a bit about the lessons I've learned. It's a cautionary tale for, first responders, their wives. It's, I'm a big advocate for, speaking about the strength that can be found in being vulnerable, which is something that my first husband taught me. He was very, very vulnerable with me when he started to understand that he was struggling, and the impact and the strength that it took for him to do that. So I'm a big advocate for having uncomfortable conversations, being very comfortable having them. I'm an advocate for setting boundaries and holding people accountable for their behaviors and actions. Mental health doesn't give people a free pass, but we can have some understanding and compassion and also set boundaries so that we are maintaining our own integrity and our own self-love. I think that's very important. It took me years and years to learn that, but I really enjoy speaking about that because I know the power that has given me in my life moving forward. So I try to keep my hands in many things. I'm an ambassador for Wounded Warriors. I have been for probably 7 years now. I do some work with the Atlas Institute for veterans and families. I have a role behind the scenes for Frontline Families Canada, which brings together widows and children of fallen first responders. And I've been part of groups like that as the widow, and my kids have been, and the difference that those types of organizations make in, we're kind of different. We're just a little different. We feel things a little deeper. We have more meaningful conversations than the average person. And to be surrounded by people who understand that firsthand, what we've been through, has been incredibly powerful. So, I still have my candle company, and I still have my art. And I keep myself busy, and I do things that bring meaning to me. And I do lots of speaking on this, and I'm so happy to do that. It's been healing for me moving forward the last few years. Just knowing, and the interesting thing is I really don't advertise anything. So I'm always so fascinated what kind of comes my way, or the messages I'll get because so-and-so heard about my book and my book was passed around, different circles, and I'll get messages. I am so fascinated by the universe and how it all works, and how when things are supposed to happen, they just kind of organically happen. And I just trust that, my book gets into the hands of people that need to read it, and my message, gets across to people that need to hear it as well. And I'm just a big advocate for living life with compassion and empathy, because we're all going through stuff, but also, doing that dance of maintaining self-love and not losing yourself in that as well. So I just think life is a series of lessons and growth. And yeah, I hope I'm done my hardest lessons. I hope I'm over the worst of it, but we'll see.
That's the thing we never know in life, right?
Never know.
I remember when my parents used to say that, the more we give, the more you get. And when I was a kid, I didn't really give a shit about the get. I just wanted, right? Like, just, where's mine? Where's mine? And going through what I've gone through in life, I get so much more when I give all of my pain, when I share my story, when, I'm present and listening. I've gotten so much out of this conversation and the times that we've spent together, right? I think it's a lot of times people don't realize the power of giving, right? And that could be giving time, that could be giving space, so many different things, but we do get way more back when we're willing to give more of ourselves. And it's hard to do when we're kind of stuck in that trauma. One of the things that I want to touch on here, because I think it's important and it's not come up in any of my talks, you talk about boundaries. And because we have mental health challenges, that there's no free paths. What are some of the boundaries that you've learned that maybe someone out there who's dealing with someone who is struggling with their own, we call mental wealth? What are some of the boundaries that you've learned that maybe somebody could benefit from? Sure.
Well, I will say learning boundaries was probably one of my hardest lessons that I ever had to overcome easily. So for me, the boundaries really came when my husband's PTSD was, doing what it was doing to the home. And for the first while, I would, like I said, I would overcompensate. Then I started to turn inward. I started to focus more on me than on him. And that was probably the best gift I could have given myself. It didn't take away his pain. It didn't minimize his pain. It just kind of gave me permission to allow myself to matter too, and to allow myself to also have needs and have feelings, and to realize that I had a line. I had to learn to, I could love someone and still have a line. And that was very difficult because when you are first setting boundaries with someone, they don't like it because you're changing the dance. And so what is for me was already hard to set a boundary. You would get a lot of pushback, which would actually look like even more chaos. But the more confident I got in it, and the more I worked on myself, and the more I started just giving myself all the things that were lacking, I started to really realize my worth. And so for me, for example, when my husband would, not show up as the hockey coach, in the past, I would make excuses for him. I would tell everyone he was working late. Because nobody really questioned it. He was in a plainclothes unit. So a lot of what he did for work was kind of on the down low. And so nobody would question when I would kind of, make those excuses for him. But I started saying, you know what, you're going to have to text him and ask him. I'm not sure. Or when he, wouldn't come to football practice and my son would be disappointed. I would have to say, before I used to, again, make excuses. Oh, dad has a headache. Dad's not feeling well. And now I would just say, you know what, it looks like dad's making poor choices again. But the important thing is I'm going to be there, and we hope dad can maybe make it there. And if not, we'll tell him all about it when we get home. And it kind of just set that example for the kids, because before that, dad could kind of, lay on the couch or sleep or do whatever he was doing to cope. And I would be running around, overcompensating, making excuses. And now my kids are seeing, oh, mom's got this. We're okay. I think it gave them some peace of mind. So setting boundaries really was just holding people accountable. And I would say that to my husband, you have tools. We understand what's wrong. We understand what's going on. At some point, we have to start using them. And if they're not working, we have to start looking and finding other ways to deal with it. So I started holding him accountable. I stopped making excuses. And, people either rise to the occasion or they don't. And I mean, he did the best he could. But, obviously his PTSD just got the best of him. But boundaries were by far the biggest life changing. And then moving forward, it was so interesting. I started setting boundaries with everyone in my life because I was like, wow, I actually have a lot of people in my life that aren't really good for me. And so I started setting those boundaries, and it was very difficult. And like I say, people don't like it. They really don't like it when you change the way that you're used to having a certain dynamic. And a lot of those people, to be honest, have fallen away. And I'm okay with that. That's the other part you have to be okay with. Going through those pockets of loneliness and uncertainty when people that have been in your life on a consistent basis are no longer actually good for you. I started to realize some of the relationships I had, we were only in a relationship because I was a bit of a doormat. And so as soon as I started to have, oh, wait a minute, I have an opinion about this, or I have an opinion about where we're going to do dinner, or whatever it was. As soon as I started to actually just be a human being and advocating for myself, all of a sudden the relationships would be tense. There'd be tension, and I'd get pushback. Well, after a while, you get strong enough, you realize some people aren't actually, enhancing my light. They're just draining my light. And you start to kind of navigate who those people are, and you kind of do a bit of a clean sweep. And then it was funny because I got to a point where I was so comfortable setting boundaries, and then I didn't even have anyone to set them with because everybody that would come into my life were so healthy for me. I was going to have this whole new group of friends and new group of, family that I chose. All of a sudden, I didn't have to set these boundaries because I wasn't attracting. I had learned the lesson. And so I that's why I say I truly think it's all about lessons. But boundaries by far, best gift you could give yourself.
Well, I think you bring up so many good points, boundaries and the word vulnerability, right? Like people don't like that word because it means that I'm going to show weakness, but no, actually it's the exact opposite, right? By setting boundaries and practicing that vulnerability and standing up for yourself, it's like, I really don't appreciate when you make me have to tell everybody that you're not coming because of whatever, right? Those things just start to empower us. And the more that we can practice that, the more courageous we become in pursuing the life that we want to have, the more confident we become in our ability to create that. Like you say, all the naysayers, all the problems tend to leave because they can't feed anymore, right? We feed all of that because of our lack of willingness to put ourselves out there to have to deal with, like you said, that really uncomfortable conflict and getting into yelling when you're starting to set boundaries. But that's kind of what we have to go through to all of a sudden realize, like, holy shit, like I can live a whole different life here.
And what the interesting thing is I am right now. I never thought, I didn't even care. There was a point I didn't even care if I found happiness again. I didn't care. And I had accepted that, okay, maybe this is just my life. I'm just going to be alone forever, and I'll just be a really good mom to my kids and a really good grandma when they have kids. And that'll just, so be it. I'll just find fulfillment by doing things that feed me, and I am now living a totally different life with totally different people and so happy. And I didn't even, and then I had to navigate the guilt of that. So there is what's called survivor guilt, where you actually feel guilty for moving on and being happy because you feel like it unvalidates the previous life that you had, or the life that you were grieving, or the life I still wish my first husband was here, and I still wish I was married to him, and I still wish my kid's dad was here and we were just doing our normal family thing intact, like a normal intact family. And so that's all still there, but I'm able to kind of put that over there and go, okay, yes, in a perfect world, but that wasn't our path. And now I'm over here and I'm living a life that I'm excited about, I'm happy about. And, very, very few people are in my life right now where I have to set boundaries. I'm not attracting that anymore. I'm carrying a different energy. I'm more empowered. I'm very comfortable in my skin. I'm very comfortable speaking my mind. I'm comfortable challenging policies and procedures on a federal level, even. Doesn't matter. Like if I don't think it's right, I am very comfortable saying that. And I think people appreciate that authenticity. I really do. When people just aren't scared to just be themselves and speak their mind. And, I'm a kind person, so I'm always thinking of others' feelings and things like that. I'm not hurtful, but there's a way to set boundaries and get your point across and still be respectful and compassionate.
The boundaries are self-love. I love myself enough to not put myself in that position. The boundary, right? I love myself enough to say no. I love myself enough to be honest, and knowing that there could be a bunch of stuff that comes back, right? All of those different things, that power of vulnerability. And Brene Brown talks about it. It's just, it's such a challenge for people. It's the first thing I look for in you, but it's the last thing I'm going to show you in me. And it's not until we get to that place where we flip that, saying that's exactly what I'm going to show, that we start to find that authenticity that is built into each of us, Sherry. It's always been there for you. It's always been there for me. We're just fortunate enough to have found it. And hopefully this conversation is going to help other people realize that if they haven't found it yet, keep looking, because it is there.
It is there. And the beautiful thing about it is once you find it, like keep digging for it, keep digging for it. And once you find it, you start to meet other people who start to energize you and instead of drain you. And I even look at when, I first met you, and I mean, we could have had coffee for days, right? When you connect and all of a sudden you're just you bringing in these authentic people, and there's so much authenticity, and you're just kind of energized, and it's refreshing, right? It's refreshing. And so, yeah, I just say my advice to people is stick with it. Find something that brings you joy, something. And the best advice I ever heard was whatever brought you joy as a kid, explore that. If you like to draw, you like to doodle, just explore that. Just for 5 minutes, just explore it with no end game. Just explore. And 9 times out of 10, what you like to enjoy as a kid will kind of bring you back to yourself.
Curiosity is the driver, right? When we get curious about how can I improve, how can I do this, how can I do this differently, that's when we start to find the answers. That's when I found them all, right? The survivor's guilt went away. The shame, the regret all started to drift. The dance became more enjoyable, right? You think about, I loved how you used that word several times today. Junior high, that first dance, it's awkward and uncomfortable and things are happening. You're not sure what's happening, but we get better at the dance. And I think that's what we have to realize is that life is just this constant evolution. And hopefully we get to enjoy the dance more and more as we go along. Sherry, thank you so much. I want to show Sherry's book, right? So where can they get a copy of this book, Sherry, if anybody wants to know?
They can go on my website, sherrylux.ca, and it's also on Amazon. And
I have to tell you, I love the candle. I have it here in my office next to the book. Again, when you get to meet those authentic people, they impact you. It smells wonderful. Where do they get these? On the website as well?
On the website, yeah. So sherrylux.ca or carislane.ca. And Bob, you're supposed to light the candle.
Yeah, I know, but it smells so good.
Yeah, you're supposed to light the candle.
Thank you for your advice. Thank you for sharing your story. I know that it's going to impact the people that are out there, and I look forward to more conversations and doing some more work with you in the future, Sherry.
Oh, you bet. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad our paths crossed, and we'll see what happens. It's been great. Thank you.
Oh, what a powerful story. So many nuggets of great information in Sherry's story there. You can see it wasn't an easy life by any means, but our lives are worth fighting for. What I always like to say is you are the most important person in your life. And a lot of what Sherry talked about today was her finding that and then being able to feel authentic in it all through all the different processes. So I hope that you've enjoyed this episode, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode of Tear Off the Tape. Take care of yourselves, and we'll talk to you soon.
You've been listening to Tear Off the Tape. For more about this show and how you can continue the dialogue about trauma, go to igotmind.ca.
A production of the Sound Off Media Company.
That's the sound that unites everyone who loves music and the stories behind it. The theme song for Records and Rockstars, the podcast born of the radio show. I'm Jeff Woods, inviting you to come listen as I shine a light on music and the rock stars who make it. Join me for Records and Rockstars on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. More at jeffwoodsradio.com.